Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Carl Daubert. I'm a mental performance coach that works in both the esport and traditional sports spaces.
What education degrees or certifications do you have that relate to sports psychology?
I hold a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in sport and performance psychology.
What is esports psychology?
So esports psychology is essentially the process of taking sports psychology concepts and ideas and transferring them into the world of esport. While esports and traditional sports share a lot of commonalities in terms of the mental side, there are definitely some really key differences that also need to be taken into account. So the idea of esports psychology has cropped up to try and suss out some of those differences and give the best optimal care to the clients, which are esports athletes, players, staff, coaches.
Is there a difference between an esport psychologist and an esports mental coach?
There can be. When you're talking about an esports psychologist, you might be talking someone who may be working a little bit more on the mental health side of things, which is definitely super important. And we need more of those in the esports space because there are a lot of mental health concerns for this population. Whereas a mental coach may be someone who's a little bit more geared towards the sports psychology side of things, which might be more around performance, trying to get you to maximize things like confidence, motivation, stress and anxiety management, as opposed to like some of the more in-depth things like depression, bipolar disorder, things like that.
Why do esports athletes and teams need a mental coach?
So this is a great question. When it comes down to it, everything that we do as human beings starts with our brain. It's all how we work on our habits, or develop our habits. It's all about, how we treat and manage our stress, our anxiety, our confidence going into certain situations. It all starts with our brain. So with that being said, both traditional and esports athletes having the access to a mental coach and someone who can work with them to maximize their brain's potential really gives them a leg up in terms of being able to compete at a really high level, and also having access to someone who's going to be able to take some of these a little bit more ethereal or floaty concepts and make them a little bit more tangible and something that they can train is really, really helpful, especially for some of the younger population that are involved in esports.
What is the biggest challenge related to esports psychology at the individual level and from the team perspective?
From an individual level, it's a lot of esports athletes not really having or maybe struggling with self-awareness, the ability to kind of recognize and diagnose their own problems. So a lot of where I start when I start working with an individual is trying to develop that skill first, because self-awareness is a skill that you can actually train. And so I'll start working with them on that. And that tends to lead them to a much better standing or understanding of where they are individually. And then kind of moving on to like the team dynamic, there has definitely been a lot of talk in the esport community about how players are essentially taken from, their houses playing by themselves and being brought into a team environment where now they're playing with the same 4, 5, 6 people consistently all the time. And when you're someone who maybe is a little bit more introverted, or you might be more, a little bit more comfortable being on your own and being in your own environment and things like that, that can lead to some friction as well for players. So from the team aspect, it's a lot of team building exercises. It's a lot of getting people to come out of their shells, be open with each other, be able to have real discussions about what the team needs as opposed to what maybe the individual wants, and kind of moving in through that modality seems to be one of the biggest things that I've seen in my work.
Do you usually consult one-on-one or with a team?
So I've done both. I've consulted, in the past, I've consulted with a lot of teams. And then over the course of my career, I've started to kind of do a little bit more individual stuff. I think both are extremely important, and being able to have access to that mental performance coach to do both the individual one-on-one kind of coaching and also maybe a little bit more of like a macro or team coaching is definitely going to have its benefits. It really is based off of what the organization wants, what the organization feels that their players need. That oftentimes dictates my interactions with the players.
Which one do you prefer, or do you think is more beneficial?
I would say that over my career, I probably lean a little bit more towards individual, and that's just a personal preference. I just feel I have my personal coaching style is a little bit more impactful at an individual level, because I can help individuals, even if they are struggling with more team dynamic related things. I can work with that particular individual to try and open up and find ways to move into that team dynamic a little bit more effectively.
What are the most common sport psychology techniques that you use with esport athletes?
Great question. So I always start with self-awareness, as I kind of mentioned earlier. Self-awareness is just the cornerstone for all of my practice, even in traditional sports. Can't really fix a problem if we don't know that we have one. So I want the athlete to be able to kind of get to a point where they can start to see their own mistakes, their own problems, their own areas where maybe they can start to, work on those and strengthen certain things. And I also want them to recognize where they are strong and what they are really good at. And that tends to help with motivation and confidence and things like that. So I always start from that perspective initially. And there are some techniques and things that I use, journaling, mindfulness training, things like that, to try and help the athlete become more in tune with their thoughts and their feelings. And then from there, we'll kind of move into a little bit more of like an athlete profile. For any sports psychology people, athlete profiles have been around since forever. And the idea being that, we're going to sit down, we're going to have a conversation about, what are the top 10 skills that you feel you need as a player to be able to play at the highest level? And where do you currently kind of rank yourself off of those different things? And then that gives us kind of a starting point of where we're going to go after we have that self-awareness piece to maximize the potential as quickly as possible.
How do you help a esport athlete that has motivation issues?
Motivation has become a big conversation during the current day and age due to just the environment that we live in right now. And so I've actually had a lot of conversations with athletes about motivation, both in traditional sports and in esports. And what I've come to find out is that the best way to try and help motivate them is to try and get them to go back to their original reasons for wanting to pursue this as a potential career. Oftentimes what ends up happening on the path to pro, as it's oftentimes called, it goes from being something that this person wants to push themselves in, something that they want to see how good they can really get, whether they can go pro, and there's this kind of internal drive, to now, once it becomes your job, now the relationship with it shifts. And we start talking about, okay, well, now you have to, hold your place on this team, and it's your livelihood. It's where your money is coming from. It's your ability to live. And that can sometimes get in the way and become the main factor for an esport athlete. And unfortunately, when it is, that monetary, or it is that position, or it is something a little bit more external, they can sometimes cause that or see that drop in motivation, because that's just not quite enough to kind of keep them going. So a lot of the conversations that I have with any athlete who's going through a motivational problem or feeling like a motivational dip is to try and kind of get them to tie that back to their original reasons for wanting to do it, and get back to a little bit more of the internal as opposed to the external.
Are there any differences with athletes in different age groups when it relates to sports psychology?
Certainly. I've seen, individuals who are 16, 17, 18 years old come into a team, and because of their age, because of their life experience, it isn't exactly the ideal situation for them. And I've also seen, people who are 24, 25, 26 actually have some of the same problems, just due to the way that esports works and the culture and how it all kind of comes together. But the age group differences can be varied. They can be very close together. They can be all over the place. It really does kind of come down to the individual, how they oftentimes were raised, the environment that they're coming from into the esport team environment. And that's a lot of times things like managers. I've personally been called more of a babysitter than an actual performance coach in some situations, just by nature of some of the tasks that I need to help some of the players grow and get with. But either way, it's all life skills. It's all stuff that these players are going to be able to use well on into their, after their careers are done and they go on to other things. So it is the age in particular is a very interesting dynamic in esports to kind of consider in my work, and even beyond that into like how coaches react with players, how managers talk to players, and some of those other considerations as well.
What do you think are the biggest challenges that esports players face?
I would say for a lot of them, it is the growing up that needs to happen very rapidly. Because due to the esports space being and the arguments still persist over whether or not it's a professional sport or not. But either way, these are individuals who are being paid quite a bit of money oftentimes to perform. And whether you consider that a sport or not, I mean, it's the same thing that a high-end football player or basketball player is being asked to do. And because of that situation and that environment that they're kind of being thrust into, there's a lot of growing up that needs to happen. There's a lot of taking on more responsibility in your own life and your decision making and things that, they likely haven't had to really consider prior to that in some cases. So that would probably be one of the biggest things in terms of like specifically like mental performance things. A lot of times it's confidence. Confidence tends to be the big one that I spend a lot of time talking about with esports athletes. When you're that young and you don't have that much life experience, and even for myself, it can sometimes get a little muddied over, am I actually good enough to be here? Can I actually perform to this level consistently? There's a lot of kind of doubt and things like that also need to be worked through. So confidence tends to be a pretty big one as well.
How does a mental coach help these athletes overcome these challenges?
A lot of my work on the one-on-one level is really starting with getting to know the player. It's impossible for them to trust me if they don't know who I am. So that's usually where I'll start with a player to try and get them to trust me a little bit. We'll have conversations about where they're from, how they got into the game title that they're playing, what other games they play before, what games do they like to play now? Do they do anything outside of gaming that they like, and just trying to get them to open up a little bit more about who they are and things like that. And that can go a really long way with then starting to implement some of the actual kind of changes into their life that I'm trying to get them to buy into. Meditation practices can sometimes seem a little goofy. So if they trust me, then it kind of helps open up that door and they'll be a little bit more willing to at least try it. And that can go a really long way in terms of them now understanding and seeing the benefit of that practice and seeing that it's actually going to help them, which again just kind of feeds into the client mental performance coach relationship, because then they'll trust me a little bit more and they'll be a little bit more willing to kind of go and do some other things. Starts with that relationship first, and then once I have that relationship, I can start to kind of figure out what steps we can start to take, even baby steps, to just get them on board with some of the interventions that are definitely going to help them with the confidence issue, with the doubt, with some of those other things that are pretty scary to talk about.
How does working with an esport athlete compare to a traditional athlete?
There are definitely, I think, some generalizations that can exist. I've been lucky in my personal practice to walk into a room with traditional sports athletes. I usually work with endurance, so track and field, cross country, some swimming and diving. So it's a very individual sport for them, which is very similar actually in a lot of ways to esports. And I've walked into a traditional sports room or with a room full of traditional sport athletes and heard crickets throughout an entire presentation. When I'm asking questions, I don't have a single hand. I've had that experience. I've had a similar experience in esports when working with them. And I've also had, esport players come up to me as soon as they hear I'm a mental performance coach and rattle off 50 questions, and they want to know who I am and what I do, and they want to just really get into the nitty gritty of things immediately. I've seen that in traditional sports as well. So it really is, and again, from my personal experience, it is meeting the athlete where they are that is more important on that side of things in terms of like the actual interaction. And there are definitely differences in terms of like what things may be important to a traditional sport athlete versus an esport athlete. I've seen personally more similarities in terms of, everyone wants to feel confident when they go into a competition. No one wants to feel so stressed that they're out of control during a competition. Everyone wants to feel like they have their anxiety pretty well put together, and that all of those things are similar across the two spaces. It sometimes is a little bit more about how I have those conversations and what those conversations or where they lead to in terms of actual interventions. That's where it can get a little bit different. But in terms of like the broad scope or the broad kind of topics that we discuss, they actually tend to be pretty similar across both traditional and esport.
Do you think it's possible to be an esports mental coach full time right now?
I would like to think so. I think that there are more and more, esports is very similar in traditional sport where it's broken down into tiers. So there's more tier 1 organizations like, Immortals, 100 Thieves, Golden Guardians, things that from the LCS and even into, things like Overwatch. I know the Los Angeles Gladiators, for instance, that's a team that I worked with in the past. They're a tier 1 organization that I know take mental wellness for their players very seriously. So it's becoming more and more prevalent, the bringing in of performance coaches. I right now am actually working really closely with a slew of performance coaches, both physical and mental, to try and create almost like an organization of sorts for us to kind of come in together and work with one another, because we see the need for what we do, but sometimes the organizations don't necessarily see it. So we're trying to kind of brainstorm some ideas of how we can work together as performance coaches to educate and hopefully get more performance coach, both mental and physical, and even stuff like diet and things like that, to be more prevalent and more long-term positions with these organizations, because it's so worth it and is such a crucial linchpin to the future of esports that we feel, we owe it both to ourselves and to the future of performance coaching in this space to push it forward as much as we can.
What advice would you give to someone who's looking to become an esports mental coach?
First and foremost, get yourself a degree in some form of sports psychology, performance psychology. Kinesiology would even be kind of cool. There's a lot of different ways that you can take those degrees and kind of shape them to what you want to do in esports. And through that, then you're going to be able to get a better understanding of the basics of what these people may be undergoing just as human beings. And then once you kind of have that, then it becomes a lot about just reaching out to different connections. As I mentioned, we're starting to kind of bring this organization together. So hopefully that will be a resource for individuals who are looking to get into the performance side of esports in the future. But there are still plenty of performance coaches out there. Find me on Twitter. I have my Twitter DMs open. I will happily kind of conversate with you about what it's like to do this job, the best people to kind of go to and talk to about, how to get in with, tier 2, tier 3 teams. Even colleges at this point are now starting to be more open to esports. And then, you come in and you say, hey, I want to work with your esports team as a performance coach or a mental performance coach, and you might be able to get some experience through that. And that might open up some of the doors that you're looking for to, kind of build your way into the space a little bit more.
How can people get in contact with you?
You can find me on Twitter it's PERF_coach_Carl. So that's @perf_coach_Carl. And then my email is performancecoachcarl@gmail.com. Definitely feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about this stuff. It's a passion of mine, and always happy to answer questions. You can also go over to performancecoachcarl.com to learn a little bit more about me personally, if you're interested in that stuff. And there's also some contact information on how to reach out to me on there as well.
Okay, thank you for your time, Carl.
No problem. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.